Hey, I'm Brian Hyatt, a senior writer with Rolling Stone, and I'm so pleased to have with me the legendary Neil Gaiman, author of many things, author of The Sandman, which is now the #1 show in how many countries on Netflix?
Many.
Many. Congratulations on
Thank
that.
you. It's been really amazing. I'm so used to Sandman being a thing that the people who love it, but they're normally fairly small. I mean, we spent when it came out as a DC comic, we were never in the top 50. We were somewhere in the bottom 50, and eventually Sandman 75 was the best-selling comic of its month, outselling Batman and Superman. But we mostly did that because everybody else's sales dropped slowly and ours just stayed up.
Right, it was the implosion of the comic book industry.
The
Yes.
implosion of the comic book industry got us to #1. So we didn't do it by being this huge thing that went to the top. But what I forget is that we've had 35 years of selling graphic novels. We've had 35 years of selling hundreds and hundreds of thousands and millions of collections of graphic novels. So now you bring out something new and it's Sandman, and the world turns out for it.
You didn't actually have to destroy the TV industry to get to #1 in this case. You actually are truly #1 by beating the other shows.
Exactly.
Yes.
As opposed to just, destroying televisions and ways of watching television all over the land.
And striding upon its waist with Morpheus. But despite being #1, it is not yet certain, last I checked, that it is being renewed. Can you talk about how that works?
Basically, the way that it works is making something like Sandman is incredibly expensive. This is not a cheap show. This is the opposite of a cheap show. This is dead expensive. And that means that in order to be renewed, we have to really perform as well as everybody could possibly hope. So everybody is very hopeful. It's all looking great. We're certainly on track for it. But it's all about how we do over the month after release.
On track sounds positive. That sounds like, were you given... Do they give you throw you breadcrumbs as far as its status? Or
Yeah, well, you get breadcrumbs, and you also get, much more importantly, most of the breadcrumbs that they give you are things that you can check publicly. How many million hours? I think last week, human beings on the face of this planet spent 127 million hours watching Sandman. That's an awful lot of Sandman.
Feels pretty good.
So that, and we were way ahead of, the next most watched thing was watched for 65 million hours or whatever. So we're doing well. We're doing great.
And you made it clear that if Netflix is foolish enough to not renew this show, there is a potential pathway to take this to another streamer or another network.
Back when we put the deal together, we made sure that there were ways to continue with Sandman, but we also all hoped that none of them would possibly be necessary because we love our Netflix people and they love us. And they've been amazing. I mean, they even made a secret 11th episode of Sandman.
Surprise this weekend.
Yes. And we managed to keep that secret despite the fact that I came very close to blowing it twice.
Yeah, you actually dropped the name of one of the actors. And
I did.
Yeah.
And also I tweeted, back before we were sort of thinking about how secret we were going to need to keep this, I tweeted the cover to a book, to the book Here Comes a Candle, and I tweeted the fact that we'd cast some of the cats. So that was, 18 months ago. Fortunately, enough people had forgotten that or thought maybe we'd cancelled it or maybe it was for something else that we got away with it.
Interesting thing about you did the Dreams of Cats story, obviously via animation, although I would have loved to see a live action version of that, so that would have been challenging. But one of the first plans for Sandman adaptation involved partial animation. So that idea has been around there for quite a while.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, back in 1996, Ted Elliott and Terry Rossio, their first or second Sandman script, and I think Roger Avery was on board as a director. They had Dream of a Thousand Cats as part of that. And it was actually Roger Avery suggesting to the top brass at Warner Movies back then that whenever we were in the Dreaming, he wanted it to be done by Jan Schwankmeyer style stop motion animation.
Wow.
Like Jan Schwankmeyer's Alice. And they didn't know what he was talking about. So he put on a screening of Jan Schwankmeyer's Alice for the Warner Movies top brass. And by the time he left the screening, he was fired from the project, and his parking space name had been painted over. They were like, "This is madness. Get rid of him. This is not mainstream."
Now, of course, there were many attempts to adapt this over the years. The one I'm sort of fond of in a sick way is that I guess under John Peters there was a version that was going to make it a really tough action movie, I think.
I've read that script, or at least
Yeah.
I haven't read the whole of the script. I've read as much of the script as I could take, and I am not sure if it would have been an action movie or quite what it would have been. It was a mess. It never got better than a mess. It had giant mechanical spiders in it. The way that it worked...
Wait, did it really?
It did.
Do you know about the John Peters mechanical spiders thing?
I heard about that later, and people were like, "Oh, you're kidding!" And I'm like, "No, I had a giant mechanical spider in it." But much more important than that, Lucifer, Morpheus, and the Corinthian were identical twins or identical triplets. They were a family of identical brothers, and it was all a race to see who could get the ruby, the helm, and the bag of sand before midnight on 1999, before the new millennium started, because whoever got it would be the winner. And that was the plot. And I remember them phoning me up, and I'm polite if you're on the phone, and I'm nice, and I try and find positive things to say to people who phone you up, because you do. And a guy in John Peters' office phoned me up, and he said, "So, Neil, have you had a chance to read the script we sent you?" And I said, "Well, yes, I did. I haven't read all of it, but I've read enough." And he said, "So, pretty good, huh?" And I said, well no, it really isn't. He said, "Oh, come on. There must have been stuff in there you loved." I said, there was nothing in there I loved. There was nothing in there I liked. It was the worst script that I've ever read by anybody. It's not just the worst Sandman script. That was the worst script I've ever been sent. And then there was a pause, and he said, "Oh, come on. That thing where we made the Corinthian, the Sandman's brother, that was good, huh?" And I said, "No, that was really stupid." And he said, "Oh, well, okay, you can win them all." And I said, "No, you really can't." And I put down the phone, and I thought, what do I do now? So I sent the script to Ain't It Cool News, which back then was read by people. And I thought, I wonder what Ain't It Cool News will think of this script that they're going to receive anonymously. And they wrote a fabulous article about how it was the worst script they'd ever been sent. And suddenly the prospect of that film happening went away. And instead, John Peters turned his attention to the Wild Wild West.
Which, I have to point out for people who don't know the story, has a giant mechanical spider in it.
He had one idea.
Yeah.
It transmuted. And he had three properties. He had,
Superman,
as you said,
yeah.
It sounds stupid. He came to Warner's. They gave him any three properties he wanted to choose because he'd left Warner's for, I think it was Sony. Warner's had sued, and they'd received an enormous payout in the legal suit because John Peters had been broken his contract and gone, and they could sue Sony. They got something stupid like $500 million. So they were so happy that he had got them that money. I mean, this is at least my understanding of things, that they said to him, you can have any 3 properties you want. And he chose Superman, Wild Wild West, and Sandman. And when I asked why has he chosen Sandman, they said because he saw a statue of Morpheus and he thought it looked cool.
Sure. And before we get off John Peters, I will say he also, according to Kevin Smith, tried to put a giant mechanical Spider-Man into Superman as well. So he did indeed have one idea, but it made it into Wild Wild West. But anyway, I was going to ask, Sandman was a DC comic book, and it wasn't, it now lives in these beautiful, various beautiful editions, and it's collected graphic novels. But it was a comic book. This is a replica that they just made of it. And the back is an ad for a classic rock, a 60s, hits of the 60s and digital sound. It was truly a comic book like any other out in the newsstand, and it grew into what it became. But a couple things. I mean, you knew Alan Moore very well. You even were something of a research assistant unofficially for Watchmen. Supposedly, he called you up to source quotations. Was that your entire contribution to Watchmen?
Yeah, that was my entire contribution to Watchmen. Although I was incredibly proud of having done. Initially, he phoned me up to get me to fight. He said, "There's a you're an educated man. There's a quote: shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" I can't remember where it's from, but I want to call this "shall not the judge of all the earth do right." And I went and checked. And I said, "Okay, it's from the Book of Job. This is where it's from." And then after that, he phoned me up saying, "I need a quote for," and I think I found him the quotes for Brother to Dragons, Companion to Owls, 7, and I got him some material on owls that he then used in the back. It was fun, just being Alan's research.
You were the owl researcher.
I was owl researcher and finder of things, and then Halloween. I found him the Halloween poem, so it was fun. And then my name is in the front of Watchmen, which is lovely.
That's incredible, and it was actually Alan. Not to get sidetracked, but Alan showed you how to write a comic book script at a comic book convention.
It wasn't a comic book convention.
Oh,
It was a British fantasy convention, and Alan came up to Birmingham, and I remember just at some point we've been hanging around, and I said, "Look, I don't know what a comic script looks like. I know what a movie script looks like, but I don't know how do you write comics? How do you get what you want out of your head into an artist's head?" And he grabbed a notebook and he sat there and he wrote, "Okay, page 1, panel 1, and then you describe what you can see." And he wrote a sample description, and then he showed me how and then if you have somebody speaking, you write their name and you write what they say. And if you have a sound effect, you have FX, splat, or whatever. And, if they think something, it's thinks. And it was like, oh, okay. And I wrote a John Constantine script for him, like a 6 or 8 pager, called "The Day My Pad Went Mad." It was called, named after a John Cooper Clarke poem. And he said, "Yeah, it's all right. It gets a bit wobbly at the end." And then I wrote another one, Jack in the Green story about a 16th century Swamp Thing, and sent that to him. And he said, "Yeah, you got it." And I thought, good, okay, now I can write comics. And afterwards, I did.
And then to continue the sidetrack, he enlisted you to continue his comic book Miracle Man.
He did.
After he left. You were writing for a publisher called Eclipse eventually, and they kind of went out of business. That story remained unfinished, and now supposedly you're going to be finishing that? Is that happening?
It's looking very like it. Given that this has taken almost 3 decades, I think we're like 29 years since the last time I was trying to write Miracle Man. I'm waiting to see what happens. But yes, Alan has described it as a bit of a poison chalice. The legal complications involved in Miracle Man were so much more complicated and tangled and weird than anybody imagined. And then there were additional complications thrown in over the years. Eclipse went bankrupt. They were bought out of bankruptcy by Todd McFarlane. He offered to trade me his share in Miracle Man for stuff that he owned. Then we looked at what he owned and we're like, but you don't own anything. It turns out Eclipse didn't actually have anything. And then we had to get deeper into who actually owned Miracle Man, and it turned out the original creator, Mick Anglo, had kept rights that people had claimed had been bought. And there's an entire book that you can buy on the mysteries of Miracle Man. But it certainly looks, I get beautiful, beautiful emails from Mark Buckingham, who is drawing away. And
so you've written the scripts. Wow. But this was supposed to happen like 6 years ago or something, wasn't it? Or was it
the legal things that the legal tangles? 6 years ago, we were all ready to come out with stuff, and then it turned out that things that we thought had been sorted out had not been sorted out. So Marvel and people had to go off and sort them out while Mark and I sat on the side twiddling our thumbs and checking our watches.
Between Miracle Man, the Good Omens TV show on Amazon Prime, which I recommend everyone to check out if they did not, and now Sandman, you've done a lot of sort of collaboration and continuation with your 20-something self, which is a very interesting thing to do. And you rarely seem to come at it from a place of, you know what, I'm so much older now and so much more experienced. Not that much older, but more experienced.
I'm definitely a lot older.
But more experienced. I've learned so much. I want to tear up what that kid did and do it better. That doesn't seem to be your approach.
On the occasions that I've gone, I am so much wiser, so much smarter, and I'm going to show you how you should have done it, 26-year-old Neil Gaiman. I often find myself a year later going, okay, so what if we just cut all that stuff that we did and make it like I did in the original book or something? Oh, that works, yeah. And I can feel 26-year-old Neil Gaiman smugly smirking at me. He was incredibly smart. So it's not that I haven't tried reshaping stuff. And I kind of enjoy reshaping stuff, but mostly he was fairly smart and he knew what he was doing. I think he often knew what he was doing, even if he couldn't have articulated it.
Do you think it was a beginner's mind kind of thing?
I think that in the case of Sandman, there was a sort of weird phenomenon going on whereby he had to get very good very fast. It's weird to talk about yourself in the third person. I had to get very good very fast.
Yeah.
I had just been offered, I'd been given a monthly comic. I honestly figured the best I was going to get would be something that would be a minor critical success, which back then was also synonymous with major commercial failure. So it's weird because I tell people now, I figured we'd get to issue 8, and I'd get the phone call that says we're not selling any, but you've got 4 issues to wrap it up in, and then we'd get to issue 12, because that was how DC used to do it. They would give something a year. But that was why I plotted the first storyline to take me to the end of of issue 8. And then I was going to have 4 issues of short stories, and then we'd be done. Except that by the time issue 8 came out, Sandman was selling more than anything like it had ever sold, or at least within the last decade or whatever. So I wasn't getting cancelled. And I got to go, okay, all of my mad plans for what I would do if I had this thing and I got to tell the story that I want to tell, those mad plans, they're now real. I can put them into effect. And that was really exciting.
The word canceled reminds me of, it would be sort of a curse worthy of a plot within Sandman if you got to see one season of this thing being brought to life so beautifully, and then we're robbed of the chance of seeing the rest. Or would you see it that way?
I wouldn't see it that way.
Okay.
I would look at, I love the 11 episodes that we've done. I think are fabulous. They're magical. I think we've got to see Tom Sturridge, you've got to see Gwendolyn Christie, you've got to see Jenna Coleman, you've got to see Mason Alexander Park, you've got to see all of these people bring Sandman characters to life. And to do it really well, and to do it in a way that is consistent with and feels like part of the comics. Most people don't get that. I spent 30-something years battling bad versions of Sandman. If what I get is 9 hours of amazing television with the budget of a big budget movie, we did great. I don't feel like, I definitely wouldn't feel like a failure. I would feel incredibly proud of what we'd made. And I don't feel, I'm trying to think, okay, would I be rationalizing fail? I don't think so. I think I just look at this and I'm so proud. You know, I said this to Ted Sarandos at Netflix. You know, he came over and he said, well, we're all very excited about Sandman. I said, me too. And I said, and I've got to say, you know, I'm so proud of what we made. I don't really care if anybody watches this or not. I'm just really proud of it. And he's like, yeah, we want people to watch it. Oh, yeah. Possibly the wrong person to say that to. But
I saw this as a pure art project. We didn't in any way take the viewers in. Yeah, right. That's probably not what. Yes, but
honestly, you know, that was always how I felt about Sandman. It wasn't. At the end of the day, I was making it for me. My idea with Sandman was, there aren't really many comics that would make me, at that time, a 27, 28-year-old person, go down to the comic store once a month and buy a comic. I want to make a comic that would make me go and buy a comic. I want to write a comic that I would love. That was my agenda. So here I kind of feel like me and Alan Heinberg, with the connivance and assistance and support of David Goyer, that's what we've made. We've made the show that we'd like to watch. We've made the Sandman that we'd like to see. It appears that other people are enjoying it. I can tell that because people keep sending me things saying, you're number one in Norway, you're number one in Nigeria, you're number one in Australia, you're number one in America, you're number one in England. So I know people are watching it, and I know they're telling other people to watch it. And obviously this is a commercial thing, and I very much want it to be commercial. But at the end of the day, I think we made it for us, because I don't know how to make it for anybody else.
If it does continue, would you want to write some episodes yourself and dive in the way that you did with Good Omens?
I like the way that we've done it so far. I co-wrote episode 1 with Alan and David. The three of us sort of had to find the tone and figure out what this thing was. So we wrote it there. And I would very happily do write or co-write an intro episode or a closing episode as we move forward. But mostly I'm there in ghost form anyway. Every time Alan Heinberg hits a bump, he's on the phone to me and we talk it out. And we're like, okay, so how do we give Calliope agency? We need her to have agency, but we can't change. We have a plot structure that we need. Okay, what is she doing? How is this working? What if this happens and stuff? So I feel like I'm in there, every step of the way, every beat of the thing, just talking it through with Alan, being there, helping, advising, occasionally just going in and rewriting some dialogue and sending it over. because often it's quicker
Yeah.
for me to just write the thing and send it than it is for me to say, why don't you do something like this, and then for it to come back and go, not quite like this, but you know.
And again, so it was a comic book. You did sign away, as far as I know, the rights to this in classic comic book fashion. Did you quite realize what you were, especially given, I don't know if Alan Moore had warned you, given his situation?
I was very aware. I was 20, what would I have been when I signed the contract? 26. And I was very aware that I am a 26-year-old being taken advantage of by a large corporation. And I'm like, okay, but on the other side of it, I remember reading a line from Johnny Rotten, John Lydon, but back when he was talking about his Johnny Rotten days, saying, as the Sex Pistols, we knew that we had to sign up with a big label. We couldn't be pinpricking our way in from a little independent on the outside. We had, if this was going to work and if it was going to reach people, it had to be from a big label. And it felt this thing that I had in my head, needed to be a DC comic, needed to actually be published and look like this. Because I wanted to reach my audience, and I knew that was the only chance I was going to get of doing it with that size thing. What I did that was different, I guess, to what Alan and other people had done was after a year of Sandman, I wrote a letter to DC Comics. I wrote to Paul Levitz, who was at that time the president publisher. And I said, okay, I've done a year. Let's talk about how much of and you guys own all this, and I've just done it as a standard work for hire deal. I think you should improve my deal. I think we should improve things. I think I should get a better deal. And I think I should get part of this thing that I've created, because if I don't, it feels unfair. And I'm doing something special. And they wrote back and said, yeah, you really are. You're doing something special, and we didn't realize how special it was going to be when you started, and here is a brand new contract for you, and it is a better contract. And no, you don't own any of this stuff, but you have a lot more say and a bigger share, and we're treating you with a lot more respect. And that was basically... And I think if they'd said no, I probably would have stopped then. Sandman might have stopped at issue 20, and I would have taken whatever clout I had and gone off and done something else somewhere else. But instead, my relationship with DC, it's still healthy 3 decades on. The idea is I do Sandman stuff every now and again. I look after and shepherd the Sandman stuff, and they have 3,000 pages of Sandman material, which sells and sells and sells, and we're all very happy.
Is that contract the reason why we don't have After Sandman and Sandman Babies and other things with other writers writing it? Was that, or is it just the respect for you?
That's more respect. That wasn't written into anything. But we've always, I don't know. And it's one of those things where I do not take it for granted. It is absolutely possible in this weird corporate world that, tomorrow Warner Discovery would sell DC to some other organization, and the other organization would go, well, Sandman's huge. You did that Netflix series, and we've only got this stuff. We want 5 monthly Sandman comics out there, just like we did with Watchmen or whatever. And I could see that happening. But right now, nobody's planning to do it, and I like living in a world in which nobody plans to do it, because it's one in which I continue working with DC.
One of the fascinating artifacts of Sandman being a DC comic is that, yes, it's this modern fantasy masterpiece, but it also, obviously intersects, especially early on, with the DC universe and DC characters. You have, there's Geez, I forgot. But Lady Metamorpho, what is her name? Is
Element Girl.
Element Girl.
Urania
yes,
Blackwell.
Yes.
Element Girl.
Somehow it's more nerdy to call her Lady Metamorpho, actually. But but you have an entire issue with Element Girl. You have Martian Manhunter is in it.
Yep.
There's all sorts of things. John Constantine, who became brilliantly Joanna Constantine in the show. But do you, looking back, regret at all including that stuff?
No, I don't regret it. I mean, the truth is, if working with the DC universe hadn't have been a continuous pain in the arse, Sandman probably would have kept much more tied into the DC universe. The reason it wasn't was because, and the reason why, after a while, the only DC universe characters I would touch would be people like Element Girl, who was so forgotten she didn't even have a page or an entry in the who's who of the DC universe, and Prez, first teen president of the United States, widely considered a joke, was because I kept trying to do things and they would be planned and they would be set up and then suddenly they'd be changed. And I just got really irritated with DC continuity. You know, I had a whole thing where an example would be at the beginning of Sandman 5. John Dee, Dr. Destiny, is escaping from Arkham, and he's meant to encounter the Joker. And I'd written this whole Joker sequence, and it went in, and suddenly I got a phone call saying, oh no, the Joker has just disappeared beneath the waters of the Gotham River, and he's believed dead. And I'm like, well, he's not dead, he's the Joker, he'll be back now. Yeah, but technically right now, he's dead. So you have to make it somebody else. I'm like, but it was the Joker, it was a good, okay, roll up my sleeves, it's now the Scarecrow. But it was that kind of thing, and I just went, I can't be bothered. I really can't be bothered to have to change things and rewrite them because somebody else has just dropped the Joker into a river. So that was really why it went. With Sandman, the TV show, people are like, oh, why have you unplugged so much from DC Comics continuity? And I'm like, because no human being watching this should actually be obligated to understand 1989 DC Comics continuity in order to make sense of this. And they're like, but you don't have the Justice League in there. And I'm like, that Justice League lineup has not been the Justice League lineup since 1996. That was the last point. The JLI, Justice League International, went away. It's now the Justice League. People would just get confused. They'd be going, well, why isn't Batman there? And who's Mr. Miracle anyway? And we didn't want the hassle. We did not want the thesaurus and trying to explain to people how things tied into 1989. So, and the place that I found very, I thought it made the most sense just to go, okay, when I was a kid, before the Crisis on Infinite Earths, which dates me, we used to have Earth 1 and Earth 2. Earth 2 was the one with the Batman and the Superman, everybody from the 1940s. Earth 1 was the one, the 70s and 80s, 60s, 70s, and 80s one. And they'd created two Earths because everybody was 30-something years older, and actually you needed to sort of create a new Earth just for continuity. And I'm like, great. The Constantine of 1989 is now in his late 60s, maybe even early 70s, that character. And let's make this Earth S. This is Earth Sandman. It's not in the DC universe. It's another Earth off to one side, but it knows the DC universe exists. It will borrow from it. It will tip its hat to it. Look, here is Jed as a 12-year-old Sandman, and he's going to be dressed like the Simon and Kirby Sandman from the early 70s.
You even threw in now, but there were DC villains on the screen there. Psycho Pirate, which is perhaps your nod to Crisis on Infinite Earths, maybe.
Well, a lot of them were Flash villains. I like
Yeah.
the fact that Flash always had the best rogues
Captain
gallery.
Cold was there,
Captain
yeah.
Cold and the Pied Piper.
Yeah, but it's the extrication. It seems like you had fun with the extrication, and yet you have House of Mystery. These wonderful nods to deep DC lore here in this big budget Netflix series.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't that we were embarrassed by any of this. It was some of it was just more like, okay, let's take the bits that make it easier on people, but let's leave in all the bits we love. And I love that the House of Secrets and the House of Mystery are on screen. I love that Asim Chowdhury and Sanjeev Bhaskar are respectively Abel and Cain. I love the fact we've got Goldie and Gregory the Gargoyle. I look at Gregory and I'm just sad that Bernie Wrightson is no longer with us, because I wish he'd lived to see Gregory the Gargoyle flying around on the screen, this thing that he made. I love all that. I think that's so much fun. And I love the fact that if you want to do weird deep dives into DC chronology, you have Leiter Hall, who in some versions of DC Comics' existence, but not really the one that we were in even by the time we got to the comic, but there is a level on which she's Wonder Woman's daughter.
Did, yes.
And
Yeah.
perhaps she is. We'll never know.
There's people who many people watch the show are like, that was Wonder Woman's daughter. Yes, in some reality, yes. And I guess
Exactly.
So. Yes, I had exactly the same reaction. But in the ending of towards the end of Sandman, without any spoilers, the graphic novels, there's a moment when Morpheus is talking to William Shakespeare. Mm-hmm. And we learned that we've learned that Morpheus helped manifest Shakespeare's creativity, and specifically what he says is that it was all there. I just opened the door. For you, what opened the door?
Lovely question. A few things opened, different doors opened. But I think the thing that really opened the door for me was getting to meet, interact, and work with people who were brilliant, and realizing that the biggest difference between them and me was they were working really hard, and that they'd set their own personal goals high. People like Alan Moore, people like Terry Pratchett, people like Clive Barker, where I'd look at what they were doing and I'd be going, oh, my idea of me as a good writer is so far down from what you're doing. Why don't I raise my sights? Why don't I just open that door and walk through it to become a really good writer rather than a, commercial writer who is writing to survive? I wrote a biography of Duran Duran. I would not personally have read it, and yet I wrote it.
And a pretty good book about Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Actually,
that one I'm still fond of. I would have read
Yeah.
that one, but I wouldn't have read my Duran book. And I learned a lot from that. I'm just like, okay, that was fine. It was great. I got the money to buy an electric typewriter and to pay my rent and to feed myself with my Duran Duran book. Now let's go forward, and let's go forward to a point of always wanting to improve as a writer, always wanting, if I can, to go places I haven't gone before. And if I get very, very lucky every now and then, I'll get to go places nobody's gone before.
The Ocean at the End of the Lane is a stage play in England. Any talk of bringing it to Broadway?
There's definitely been talk of bringing it to Broadway, but all I know is I only know one thing about it coming to Broadway, which is when I called them up and said, that amazing neon sign that you've got outside the Duke of York's Theatre in London, when you're done, is there any possibility of me being able to like buy the sign? And they said, Neil, we are going to need it for Broadway. Ooh. So I thought, okay, well, they're obviously planning to go to Broadway. But more than that, I do not know. I hope they do. It's an astonishing play. The Joel Hallwood's script, Katie Rudd's direction, so powerful. And I've never had the experience of sitting in a theater filled with people crying, and crying at different points, but not crying because they're sad, crying because there are things that are going on the stage that are too big to fit into their hearts. And that sounds really wanky, for which I apologize. But it's a thing. I've seen it, and I've seen it over and over again, and it's happened to me. And the first time it happened to me, I was incredibly embarrassed because I'm like, I wrote the novel. I shouldn't be sitting here. And I'm in a rehearsal room, and everybody can see me, and I'm discreetly flicking tears away. And then the next time it happened, I was at the National Theatre on opening night, and I'm sitting between my wife, who is sobbing, which is not in itself unusual because she cries at emotional things. And on the other side of me is a journalist from one of the leading English newspapers, and I'm watching his tears plopping onto his notepad as he's taking notes, and I'm going, okay, if you're crying, then something's happening here. So Ocean does big magic things in your heart.
You've spoken about having less energy, creative energy, than when you were 28 years old, because you were doing Sandman and I think Good Omens at the same time.
And Books of Magic.
And Books of Magic, right.
I was writing. Because I remember I would write Sandman until midnight, Books of Magic from midnight until 2:30 in the morning, and then Good Omens from 2:30 in the morning till 5 in the morning, and then go to bed. I look at that now and I'm going, how did you do that? How did you have a brain that would do that? I don't. These days I have to sort of work myself up to writing a shopping list. So
how do you, as you continue on, and there's people like Philip Roth who he retired eventually, but up until he was about 80, he focused his life to be able to continue to create. How do you grapple with that slightly diminished energy?
Let's put it this way. Right now, I am show running, actively editing 2 television series. I'm seeing another one through the promotional stages. It's been through post-production and so forth. I'm just about to start writing a new 6-episode thing all on my own. I've got a novel that needs to be finished, and I'm looking after a 6-year-old boy. So I'm doing okay. There is diminished energy, but I am somehow managing to juggle all this stuff, and I'm still enjoying it. I think that's actually much more than just the list of stuff. I'm so proud of Good Omens season 2. I think it's wonderful. I'm so excited about Anansi Boys because it feels like something that nobody else has made. I'm so proud of Sandman. And obviously with Sandman, working with Alan Heinberg on breaking down all of the stories and the planning for season 2, assuming that we are fortunate enough to get a season 2, we need to be ready to go the moment that the flag comes down. And really just enjoying it all. And enjoying being a dad to a 6-year-old too. That's fun.
Yes. And before I let you go, Good Omens season 2, you're breaking free of the book at this point. How is that working?
Oh, it's wonderful. It's so much fun. And partly because I learned so much. The first time you do something, you just learn how to do it. and then you can start to play. So when I wrote and made Good Omens, I was learning, how do you do a Good Omens? I think there's this thing in my head, but how does it work? Good Omens Season 2, I know how to make Good Omens now. And I feel like, Good Omens was chopsticks. This is much more me getting to actually sort of bring in the whole orchestra.
This is the Goldberg Variations. Okay, it's an orchestra.
Exactly.
Okay. And then
I went off.
Yeah.
Could have gone on to music, but went to an orchestra.
And then finally, you've gotten to speak perhaps too much for your taste about the origins of Sandman itself. I think you've now broken it down. But one thing I'm curious about is not so much the character in the series, but since you did end up starting the series the same way, the TV series the same way, where did the conceit of, someone tries to trap death, instead they trap this entity and he's imprisoned, and then the whole rest of it is dealing with the consequences of, these many years of him being in prison. Where did all that come from?
A lot of it came out of me in October 1987, dealing with the aftermath of a hurricane, a literal hurricane. We had the first hurricane in England that we'd had for 500-600 years, and there was no power. The little village I was in the middle of the woods, so we were kind of cut off, and I had nothing to do but think. And I just remember an awful lot of walking around and thinking and walking around and thinking and going, okay, I've got this character, but how would this work? And how does that work? And how do I get from here to there? And I just remember building the first 8 episodes and then writing the outline. And as soon as the power came on, it had been about a week, and the power came on, and writing an outline and sending it off to DC Comics, to my editor, Karen Berger, and saying, okay, I think this is it. It was, and a lot of it came from the idea that I didn't know if I was ever going to get to do this again. I'd never written a monthly comic. I'd written a handful of small things, a handful of short stories that had sold, a handful of comics. This may be my only chance, I thought, ever to actually get a mainstream comic published. So I was going to get everything in there. And I was going to do, and I started out going, well, it's a horror comic, so I'm going to do every different kind of horror. I'll start out with episode 1, issue 1, and that'll be like, British respectable horror. And then issue 2, I'll do EC Comics and DC Comics kind of horror. And issue 3, I'll do Ramsey Campbell, Clive Barker, contemporary splatterpunk horror. And issue 4, I'll go to hell, and I'll do that kind of 1940s unknown worlds kind of magical thing. And and issue 5, 6, I'll just go hog wild and see how far and weird I can go. And issue 8, I'll try and kiss everything better, and we'll meet death and we'll go for a walk. And after that, I have no idea what's going to happen. But that's my story.
And finally, before I let you go, you are not like some of your colleagues. You are not a magician. You don't do rituals. There are other comic book writers of your era from England who do all of that.
There are,
as you well know. Do you not believe in a spiritual dimension at all? Do you think we're just our bodies?
I just don't ever want to be limited to one thing. I mean, what I love is having infinite possibilities. I can believe so many things, many of them utterly contradictory. And I feel like if I had to pick one, then now I'm locked into what I can write and what I can choose. I was telling somebody the other day, when I was about 25, 26, I was standing on East Croydon Station in London, on the way to London, and I saw somebody reading a copy of The Sun, which is an English... It's a rag, but it's not tabloid in the way that American tabloids are tabloid.
Right.
It's, it's sort of rubbishy, but you're assuming that the front page is probably bears some relation to reality.
You saw that werewolves... Someone claimed to have found a werewolf, and you were
werewolf
disappointed.
Captured
Yes.
in Southend. And my heart broke. It really... I remember the moment. It was just like this, oh, no. No, I do not want a werewolf to have been captured. No werewolves must ever be captured, because the moment that a werewolf is captured... there will be werewolf rules. And I will not be able to write werewolf stories. I want to be able to reinvent a werewolf for any occasion. I need my werewolf to be whatever I need my werewolf to be for my story. I need my angels to be whatever my angels could be for my stories. And so for me, I look at the many British magicians who also write comics, and I go, these are my friends, and I think they're wonderful. But it certainly wouldn't be my choice of thing to do. I like the fact that, for me, I get to practice magic as a writer. That's what I get to do. I get to make magic. I get to create things that are not, and never have been, and never will be, but I got to make them, and I got to take people to places that don't exist, and I got them to cry real tears over people who have never been in the world and who never died. And for me, that's the real magic.
Sounds like magic to me. Are you still in touch with Alan Moore, by the way? Are you on good terms with him?
I remain on good terms with Alan. I just got sent his a book called Illuminations, which is his short story collection, which is absolutely fabulous. The little plug for somebody else's book here. Alan's book, short stories, it must be coming out fairly soon. And it has in it some stories I'd read, some stories I hadn't read, and a short novel called, I think, All We Can Know About Thunderman, which is Alan writing about his version of a history of comics from a sort of slightly alternate dimension. It's wonderful writing.
So in addition to all the magical work you've given us, you've also pulled off the magic trick of staying on good terms with Alan Moore. So that's also impressive. But Neil Gaiman, thank you so much for joining us.